My name is Dulce Whitford. I'm 28 years old. And for most of my life, my family treated me like a beautiful piece of furniture that didn't quite match the rest of the room, present, but never quite right, never where it truly belonged. While my sister Miranda stacked Harvard degrees and glowing praise like trophies in a glass case, I was handed scraps, mocked at dinner tables, frozen out of decisions, paid a fraction of what she earned doing work that mattered a fraction as much. And then one night, at my sister's graduation party at the Plaza Hotel, surrounded by 350 of Manhattan's most polished people, a gray-haired stranger crossed a crowded ballroom and handed me an envelope. Inside it was a truth my parents had never once considered, that while they spent 20 years writing me off, someone who loved me had been watching everything. My grandmother had seen it all. Every slight, every snicker, every moment they treated me like an embarrassment. And she had been preparing something that would turn the entire Whitford empire on its head. My family was old Manhattan money, the kind where your surname appears on hospital wings and the side of museum buildings. My father, Gerald Whitford, ran Whitford Properties, a commercial real estate company that my grandmother, Eleanor, had built from a single rented office in Brooklyn back in 1965. By 2024, the company's valuation sat at $92 million. Gerald hadn't built any of it. He'd inherited it, but you'd never know that from the way he carried himself. I came into the world with dyslexia. I was 7 when a specialist finally put a name to what I'd been experiencing. The way letters on a page would shift and rearrange like puzzle pieces that refused to stay still, turning even the simplest sentence into a slow, exhausting negotiation. Reading took me 3 times longer than my classmates. Comprehension lagged behind my curiosity. And in a household where achievement was the only currency that mattered, that made me a liability from the very beginning. My parents' response to my diagnosis wasn't compassion. It was embarrassment. My sister Miranda received violin lessons at Juilliard, French immersion courses, one-on-one SAT prep with a Princeton graduate who charged $400 an hour. When I worked up the nerve to ask about getting support for my reading, real, structured support, my mother Priscilla looked at me the way you look at a bill you can't afford to pay. "Dulce," she said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "We've already spent so much on specialists. There comes a point where we have to accept that some children simply aren't built for academics." I was 12. I took her word for it, so I taught myself other ways. Audiobooks became my closest companions. I developed a personal system of diagrams and flowcharts and color-coded visual notes, a whole private language for understanding the world that didn't require my eyes to decode rows of swimming text. And every Sunday afternoon without fail, I would take the train uptown to my grandmother Eleanor's apartment on the Upper West Side, where she would sit with me for hours and explain things through stories instead of textbooks, through pictures instead of paragraphs. "Dulce," she told me one afternoon, her thin, warm hand folded over mine. "You take longer to read a page than most people, but you see things in that page that most people walk right past. That's not a disability, sweetheart. That's a different kind of vision." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I held on to it the way you hold on to something precious even before you understand why it matters. Then I spent the next 19 years surviving the Whitford family's version of love. Christmas 2018. 20 relatives around the mahogany table in my parents' Upper East Side townhouse. Crystal chandeliers, catered everything. The annual performance of Whitford family perfection, staged and rehearsed like a Broadway show that never quite made it to opening night. My father stood at the head of the table, wine glass raised, voice already carrying that boardroom weight he wore everywhere. "I have an announcement," he said. The room leaned in. "Miranda has been accepted to Harvard Law School, full scholarship." The applause was immediate, cheers from every corner. Miranda tilted her head with practiced, radiant modesty. Our father beamed like he'd personally constructed her out of superior materials. "My eldest daughter," Gerald continued, "will be the first Whitford to attend Harvard in 3 generations. She's going to take this family and this company to heights we can't yet imagine." More applause. Uncle Richard thumped Miranda on the back. Aunt Catherine wept delicately into a cloth napkin, and then Gerald's gaze drifted down the table, down past the gleaming silverware and the centerpieces and the careful arrangement of people who mattered until it landed on me. "And Dulce," he said. A pause stretched out like taffy being pulled until it snapped. The warmth in his voice did not survive the pause. "Well, Dulce is also here." Soft laughter rippled around the table. The kind of laughter people produce not because something is funny, but because they don't know what else to do with the silence. Miranda didn't defend me. She laughed along with them. I stared at my plate. The roasted lamb blurred. The tears didn't fall because I wouldn't let them. Not here. Not in front of all these people who would simply add my crying to the list of things about me that made everyone uncomfortable. Under the table, a hand found mine. Thin fingers, papery skin, a grip that was still surprisingly firm. My grandmother, Alina, seated near me, squeezed once. When I looked up, her eyes were on her son, and the expression in them wasn't gentle. It was furious. She said nothing. Not that night. But 3 months later, she called me to her apartment and told me she needed to show me something important. I didn't understand at the time that what happened at that Christmas dinner, that moment of casual, public cruelty with 20 witnesses, had quietly set a timer on something she'd been building for years. After graduating from a state university in 2022, not an Ivy, never an Ivy, that distinction had been communicated to me in 100 wordless ways. I applied for a position at Whitford Properties. I wanted in. I wanted to show that the family business could be my path too, that I had something to offer. My father agreed to bring me on as an administrative assistant. Salary, $42,000 a year. That same month, Miranda joined the company as chief legal counsel at $280,000 plus bonuses. My job was to photocopy documents, schedule conference rooms, and carry coffee to executives who couldn't be bothered to learn my first name. I was never invited to a meeting. Never shown a contract, never asked for an opinion, but I watched and I listened. And somewhere in those long, quiet hours in the copy room, I discovered something about myself that no one in my family had ever taken the time to notice. I could read patterns the way other people read text. When executives talked strategy in the hallway, I'd sketch out the relationships between all the moving pieces, the money flows, the pressure points, the potential problems before they became actual ones. It was the same skill I'd developed as a child to compensate for what I couldn't do the conventional way, except now it was worth something. My grandmother had taught me this, too. During those Sunday visits, she used to pull out old contracts from the company's earliest days and spread them on the dining room table. And she'd walk me through them, not as legal documents to be parsed, but as systems to be understood. Your father reads a contract the way a predator reads the landscape, she told me once in early 2019 when her health had just begun its quiet decline. He looks for what he can take. You read it the way an architect reads a blueprint. You see how all the pieces hold each other up. That same day, she'd pressed a small mahogany box with brass hinges into my hands. "Keep this," she said. "Don't open it yet. You'll know when the time is right." I'd brought it home. I tucked it in my closet. I tried to forget about it. And mostly I succeeded because the weight of everyday survival at Whitford Properties left very little room for mystery. March 2019, Alina's apartment. She was 82 that spring. The woman who had once seemed immovable, who had built an empire in an era when people like her weren't supposed to, had grown smaller, thinner, more fragile in her chair. But her eyes hadn't changed at all. Those eyes could still make you feel like she was reading your entire interior life off the back of a menu. "Sit down, Dulce." I sat across from her in the room where I'd grown up spending Sunday afternoons. The walls were covered in photographs I'd memorized over the years. Alina breaking ground on her first Brooklyn property in 1965, a hard hat askew on her silver hair. Alina shaking hands with the mayor. Alina accepting a Women in Business award with a smile that said she'd earned it, in ways the plaque couldn't possibly describe. Not a single photograph of my father at the helm of anything. "I built this company with my own hands," she said. "One rented office, one secretary, 60 years of showing up, your father." And something flickered briefly across her face, something close to grief. "Inherited what I built. There's a difference. He doesn't feel it, but I do." "He judges people by their credentials," I said, "by what they've got on paper." "I know he does. And I judge people by how they treat the ones who can't fight back." She held my gaze for a long moment. "You are the only person in this family who has ever been truly kind, Dulce. Not polished, not strategic, kind. There's a difference there, too." She pushed the box back toward me, the same one she'd given me months earlier. "There is something inside that will matter to you one day, but not today. You're not ready. And honestly, Gerald isn't ready either. When the moment comes when he shows you exactly, undeniably who he is, you'll know what to do." I wanted to press her. What's inside? Why me? What are you planning? But before I could form any of those questions out loud, she shifted the conversation to the weather, to the book she'd been reading, to the garden at her summer place upstate. The door was closed, gently but completely. 18 months later, she was gone. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless. I held her hand at the hospice on a rainy Tuesday morning while everyone else in the family found reasons to be elsewhere. The box stayed in my closet, unopened, heavy with something I wasn't yet ready to know. April 2024. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Subject line, position restructuring, confidential. Dear Ms. Whitford, as part of ongoing organizational optimization, your current position will be eliminated effective July 1st, 2024. HR will contact you regarding severance options. I read it 3 times. The letters did their usual shuffling act before settling back into the same unbearable message. They were letting me go. That evening, I stayed late filing papers that would never be touched again. Through the thin office wall between my cubicle and my father's corner suite, I heard 2 voices, Gerald and Priscilla. We can't have her here when Miranda takes over, my father was saying, his tone brisk and businesslike, the same voice he used to discuss quarterly returns. It looks terrible, the incoming CEO's sister working as a secretary. People will ask questions. What kind of questions? My mother's voice, softer, careful. Why she isn't in leadership, why we haven't promoted her, why she's, a pause that said everything. Why she's the way she is. My mother's reply came gentle, almost tender, which was somehow worse. We've done everything we could, Gerald. Some children simply don't have what it takes. Exactly, so she needs to go. We'll make the severance generous. She can find something more appropriate elsewhere. I pressed my palm flat against the partition wall. $42,000 a year. My studio apartment in Queens, shared with 2 roommates, cost $1,800 a month. I had no savings, no safety net, no emergency fund. Without this job, I'd be 2 months away from losing my home. But the money wasn't the thing tightening in my chest like a fist. It was the understanding, slow, cold, settling into my bones, that if I accepted this, if I walked out of here and quietly became exactly what they'd always said I was, I would spend the rest of my life proving them right. Not because I had actually failed, but because they had never once given me a real chance to do anything else. Miranda's graduation party was tomorrow. I sat in my cubicle in the dark and wondered what else my father had planned. May 15th, 2024. The Plaza Hotel. Grand ballroom. 350 guests. Business partners, white shoe lawyers, investment bankers, family members I could place vaguely but couldn't name. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across silk tablecloths. A 12-piece orchestra filled the corners with Gershwin. This was Gerald Whitford's theater, his stage, the arena where he performed the role he'd cast himself in: patriarch, mogul, builder of legacies. I stood in the entrance in a black Zara dress, $79, and my most presentable heels. Around me, silk and diamonds and tailored Italian everything. The most expensive thing I was wearing was the expression on my face. My mother intercepted me before I'd taken 3 steps into the room. Dulce. Her eyes did their usual sweep, drugstore makeup, clearance heels, the whole assessment completed in under 2 seconds, her lips pressed thin. Is that really the best you could do? It's what I have. Well, she adjusted her Cartier bracelet with the practiced gesture of someone reminding herself what she has. You're at table 27, near the service entrance. Try not to make it obvious that you're there. She began to turn away. And Dulce. She leaned in, Chanel number 5 arriving before her words did. Tonight belongs to Miranda. Whatever you're carrying, whatever resentment you've convinced yourself you're entitled to, I need you to keep it contained. Don't embarrass this family. She walked away before I could point out that she'd just done in 30 seconds what she was warning me not to do all evening. Table 27 was tucked behind a structural column, partially invisible from every angle that mattered. My table mates were cousins I'd encountered maybe twice. From my obscured vantage point, I could see the main stage, the enormous portrait of Miranda in her Harvard Law regalia, the sweeping banner. Congratulations, Miranda Whitford, Harvard Law Class of 2024. And near the entrance, standing alone beside the door, a silver-haired man in a gray suit. He wasn't mingling, wasn't eating, just watching the room with the focused calm of someone who had come specifically for one purpose. His eyes found mine across the crowd. Something cold and exact ran down the back of my neck. At 8:30, the orchestra stopped. The lights shifted. A spotlight found my father on the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gerald began, his voice filling the room the way he always filled rooms, with total confidence that the room belonged to him. "Thank you for being here to celebrate someone truly extraordinary." The applause started before he finished the sentence. Miranda Whitford graduated in the top 5% of her Harvard law class. She clerked for Justice Reynolds. And last month she was placed on the partner track at Sullivan and Cromwell in what I am told was record time. He paused, savoring it. But tonight I am not simply celebrating her achievements. I am announcing her future. Miranda joined him on stage, radiant and composed in Emerald Valentino. Effective upon my passing, Miranda Whitford will receive my complete personal estate, including our Park Avenue residence, currently valued at $13 million. And another pause, this one theatrical, the position of Chief Executive Officer of Whitford Properties upon my retirement. The room came apart at the seams. Standing ovation. Camera flashes going off like a lightning storm. Miranda covered her eyes with her fingertips in the universal gesture of someone performing being overwhelmed. 350 people on their feet, and not one glance directed toward table 27. The cousins seated beside me leaned over. A woman I'd last seen at a funeral 8 years ago. "Dulce, right? So what does all that mean for you?" I opened my mouth, closed it. What was the honest answer? That I had just been formally and publicly erased. That the termination letter already sitting in my inbox was merely the first chapter. That 20 years of hopping my family would look at me and see something worth seeing had just been eulogized in front of everyone who mattered to them. The applause was still rolling when the silver-haired man at the door began walking toward me. Slow, deliberate, exactly like someone who had been waiting for this specific moment. He stopped at table 27. "Miss Whitford." "That's me." I sat up straighter. "Can I help you?" "My name is Jonathan Ellis." He drew a business card from the breast pocket of his jacket. Cream stock, embossed lettering. Morrison and Blake, attorneys at law. "I was your grandmother's personal counsel." Words landed somewhere in my solar plexus. "Eleanor passed away 3 years ago." "I'm aware," he said without softening. "She left something for you along with very specific instructions regarding when I was to deliver it." He produced from inside his jacket an envelope, heavy cream stock, sealed in red wax bearing a notary's stamp. "What is this?" "Her will." His voice dropped to just above conversational. "The real one, the one your father has never seen." I stared at the envelope. The notary seal read Morrison and Blake, dated September 12th, 2019. 5 months after that Sunday afternoon in her apartment. 5 months after she'd pressed the mahogany box into my hands and told me I'd know when the time was right. "I don't understand," I said, though somewhere underneath the confusion, I was beginning to. "Your grandmother's instructions were clear," Ellis said. "I was to deliver this document on the day your father publicly disinherited you." He glanced toward the stage, where Gerald and Miranda were still receiving congratulations from every direction. I believe that moment just occurred. My hands were unsteady as I accepted the envelope. "Mr. Ellis, what's inside?" For the first time, something almost human moved through his expression. "She asked me to tell you. Give this to Dulce on the day Gerald finally shows her exactly who he is. By then, she'll be ready." He straightened his jacket. "I'll be available when you have questions." "You have my card." He turned and dissolved back into the crowd. I couldn't breathe inside that ballroom. I pushed through the service entrance and found an empty corridor near the kitchen, fluorescent lights, stainless steel counters, the muffled sound of celebration leaking through the walls like something from another world. My hands shook as I broke the wax seal. 3 pages, dense legal language, a notarized signature. The date, September 12th, 2019. I read slowly, carefully. The letters did their familiar dance, but I held them still through sheer force of will. I could do this. I had always been able to do this when it mattered enough. I, Eleanor Margaret Whitford, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous testamentary documents and declare this to be my last will and testament. My eyes found a paragraph toward the bottom of the second page. To my granddaughter, Dulce Ann Whitford, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Whitford Properties LLC, currently valued at approximately $47 million, along with all voting rights associated therewith. I read it twice, then a third time. 51%, controlling interest. The will continued, and what it said next was the part that undid me completely. This bequest is made with full knowledge of my son Gerald's treatment of Dulce. She has been excluded, diminished, and denied opportunity, not due to lack of ability, but due to lack of support. Dulce is not slow. Dulce was abandoned, and I will not allow her father's prejudice to define her future after my death. I pressed my back against the cold corridor wall. A sound came out of me that I immediately swallowed, something between a sob and a laugh, or maybe a sound with no name that exists only in moments like this one. She had seen everything. Every dinner table, every whispered dismissal, every Christmas. She had watched, and she had documented, and she had planned. There was one condition attached to the bequest. To activate this inheritance, Dulce must formally request an emergency board meeting within 72 hours of receiving this document. Failure to act within this window will render this will null and void, and all assets shall revert to the 2015 testament. 72 hours. The window would close at 8:30 p.m. on May 18th. 3 days. My grandmother had given me a weapon, and now I had to decide if I was brave enough to lift it. Jonathan Ellis was waiting near the coat check when I emerged. "You've read it," he said. "The 72-hour clause." My voice was steadier than I'd expected. "Why would she build that in?" He handed me a second card, his personal cell number written in neat script on the back. "Because she knew you. She knew that if she gave you unlimited time, you would spend most of it trying to talk yourself out of acting. The deadline isn't a punishment, Miss Whitford. It's permission. Permission to stop waiting for your family to come around. To stop asking for something they were never going to give you freely." Through the ballroom doors behind me, I could see my father still center stage, still receiving compliments like interest payments on a loan that would never come due. My mother circulating with practiced grace, accepting congratulations as though she had personally manufactured Miranda's achievements. If I did this, if I walked into that boardroom and presented this will, there would be no recovering what remained of my family. No quiet reconciliation. No later moment where everyone forgot and forgave. But if I didn't, I would accept their verdict. I would become the footnote they had always wanted me to be. "Miss Whitford," Ellis spoke quietly. "Your grandmother spent the final years of her life preparing for this single moment. She believed in you in ways that are documented in that will, and in considerably more documentation besides. The question you need to answer is whether you believe in yourself." I looked at the will in my hand, at the elegant signature of the woman who had held my hand under Christmas tables and taught me to read the architecture inside a contract. "I'll call you tomorrow morning," I said. "We're requesting that board meeting." Something shifted in Ellis's expression that might, in better lighting, have been a smile. "She said you would." That night, back in my small Queens apartment, I finally opened the mahogany box. My roommates were asleep. The only light was the orange stripe of the street lamp falling through my window. I sat cross-legged on my bed with the box in my lap, 5 years of wondering about it pressing against the back of my breastbone. The brass hinges creaked. Inside, a handwritten letter on a leaner's personal stationery, a document with a 1965 date stamp, and a USB drive, small, modern, clearly added years after the box itself. I reached for the letter first. "My dearest Dulce, if you're reading this, Jonathan has done his job and your father has done exactly what I feared he would. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you while I was still here, but I can protect you now." The document enclosed is the original partnership agreement from 1965, when I founded Whitford Properties alongside 2 colleagues who are long since gone. Your father has never seen it. It establishes that the founders' shares carry permanent voting rights that cannot be diluted or transferred without full board approval. The USB contains something else, something your father hoped I had forgotten. In 2018, Gerald proposed a board resolution to reduce my voting rights from 51% to 10%. His stated reason, that I was too old to understand modern business. His real reason, he wanted total control, and I was the only obstacle between him and it. The board rejected his proposal by 2 votes. Mine was one of them. I never forgot what he tried to do. And I never forgave him for the way he chose to justify it by tearing you down, as though diminishing you somehow proved that I was unfit to lead. As though your struggles made his ambition more reasonable. Use all of this wisely, Dulce. Not for revenge, for justice. All my love, Grandma Leaner. I sat with the letter for a long time before I plugged in the USB. The file was labeled, Board Meeting Minutes, March 2018, PDF. My father's attempt, documented and time-stamped to strip his own mother of the power she had spent 60 years earning. I read it twice. Then I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and lay in the dark listening to the city. By morning, I knew exactly what I needed to do. May 16th. Margaret Coleman answered on the second ring. Dulce Whitford. Her voice carried decades in it, rough, warm, the sound of someone who had laughed too hard and too often to have anything left to prove. I wondered when you'd finally call. You know who I am? Sweetheart, your grandmother and I built half of Brooklyn together through the 70s. She talked about you constantly. She also told me about the will 3 years back, right before she passed. I gripped the phone. Then you know what I'm about to do. I know what you're considering doing, she said. There's a difference. What you want requires 3 board members to sign the petition. I'm one, you'll need 2 more. Can you help me find them? I can do considerably better than that. I heard papers shifting somewhere on her end. Gerald Whitford is not as well liked as he believes himself to be. His management approach, I'll call it what it is, autocratic, has rubbed at least 4 board members the wrong way. They've talked, privately. They just needed someone willing to go first. Who? Richard Holloway, Susan Parker. Both have been on the wrong end of your father's temper during closed sessions. I'll make some calls. Hope was a strange, tentative sensation in my chest, like a window being opened in a room that had been sealed shut for a long time. Dulce, I need you to hear me clearly on something. This will not be pleasant. Your father will fight. Your sister will fight. They will say things you won't want to hear. They've been saying things I didn't want to hear my entire life. She laughed, warm and real and genuine. Alina always said there was steel under all that quiet in you. I'm starting to believe it myself. A pause. Petition will be ready by tonight. Board meeting, May 18th, 10 a.m. Whitford Tower, 42nd floor. Don't be late. Thank you, Margaret. Thank me when you're sitting at that table, not before. Gerald found out about the board meeting request at 4 o'clock on May 17th. I know this because Miranda called me 45 minutes later, voice coiled tight as a watch spring. What did you do? I was at my desk, organizing files no one would ever open. I'm not sure what you mean. Dad just received a notice from the board secretary. Emergency meeting tomorrow morning, requested by Margaret Coleman and 2 other directors. Margaret Coleman hasn't initiated anything in 15 years. What did you do? Perhaps she has concerns about company governance. Don't play games with me, Dulce. The careful composure was cracking along very precise fault lines. If you're doing this to make some kind of scene, to embarrass us after everything. I'm doing my job, I said. Same as always. She hung up. 20 minutes later, Gerald walked past my cubicle on his way to his office, jaw set like concrete, not so much as a glance in my direction. He slammed the door hard enough to rattle every window on the floor. Ridiculous waste of time, I heard through the wall. Margaret's probably going senile. We'll address her concerns and move on in 15 minutes. A pause. Miranda, it's Dulce. She can barely read a spreadsheet. She is not a threat to anything. I let myself smile, quietly alone. For the first time in 28 years, being underestimated felt less like a wound and more like a strategy. That night, I laid out everything I had. 3 copies of the will, printed on clean paper. The 2018 board minutes downloaded to my phone as a backup. A short statement, not an argument, not an accusation, just an orderly presentation of facts in the clearest possible sequence. Jonathan Ellis confirmed by text that he would attend as authenticating counsel. Margaret sent a message at 11. Petition filed. See you in the morning. She would be proud of you. I barely slept. But for the first time in recent memory, it wasn't anxiety keeping me awake. May 18th, 2024, 9:45 a.m. Whitford Tower. The elevator opened onto the 42nd floor. Italian marble. Floor-to-ceiling windows pouring Manhattan light into every corner. The kind of space that has been deliberately engineered to make certain people feel small. I stepped out wearing a borrowed gray blazer, 2 sizes too large, from my roommate, and carrying a leather portfolio I'd found at a Goodwill store for $12. The security guard at the boardroom door held up a hand. Name? Dulce Whitford. He checked his tablet. Frowned in that specific way people frown when something doesn't compute. You're not on the authorized attendee list. A Whitford Properties employee with business before the board. Ma'am, this is a restricted. Is there a problem? Miranda's voice from behind me. I turned. Navy power suit, Hermes scarf, every inch of her assembled with the precision of someone whose entire identity was architecture. She looked at me the way you look at weather you hadn't predicted. Dulce. Her smile performed warmth without delivering any. What are you doing here? I have information to present to the board. Information. She laughed, short, bright, sharp as cut glass. About what? You work in the copy room. The nature of my presentation is confidential. You don't even return on investment, I said. It's not a complicated concept. Her smile flickered. Before she could reload, my father appeared at the end of the hallway with 2 senior executives bracketing him like a police escort. What's going on? Dulce wants to attend, Miranda said, in the tone of someone reporting something mildly absurd. I was explaining why that isn't possible. Gerald looked at me, the look that had followed me my entire life, like I was something that needed to be managed rather than someone who warranted acknowledgement. Dulce, go back to your desk. This has nothing to do with you. Actually, a voice called from inside the boardroom. It does. Margaret Coleman appeared in the doorway. 72 years old, silver-haired, standing with the complete ease of a woman who had outlasted every person who had ever doubted her. I invited her. She is standing to address the board. She looked at my father with an expression as flat and final as a court ruling. Let her in. Gerald's jaw worked silently. Margaret Coleman had been a board member for 32 years. Her authority in that room didn't require his permission or his approval. Fine. The single word delivered at below 0. Let her speak. We'll see how long it takes her to humiliate herself. As I passed my sister, she leaned in close enough that only I could hear. You're embarrassing yourself. I walked into the boardroom. 12 board members around a polished walnut oval. Portraits of past executives lining the walls, and there, directly above the fireplace, my grandmother Alina in oils, her painted gaze fixed on some point in the room's middle distance, still watching everything. I was directed to the chair at the far end of the table, the symbolic end, the place where people sit when the meeting isn't really for them. Jonathan Ellis was in a corner chair with his briefcase. He gave me one small, measured nod. Board Chairman Robert Hartley called the session to order. Mid-60s, silver at the temples, a man who had known my grandmother for 2 decades and who carried that knowledge in his expression the way some people carry old photographs carefully, with awareness of what they hold. This emergency session was requested by Margaret Coleman, Richard Holloway, and Susan Parker. Margaret, you have the floor. Margaret rose. Thank you, Robert. I'll be brief. The matter concerns a document that has recently come to the board's attention, a document with direct implications for the ownership structure of this company. She gestured toward me. I yield my time to Miss Dulce Whitford. Every pair of eyes in the room rotated toward me. Miranda's smirk was visible from where I sat. Gerald leaned back in his chair with the performative boredom of a man who believes the meeting has already been decided. I stood up. My hands were steadier than they had any business being. Thank you, Mrs. Coleman, and thank you to the board for making space for me today. I opened the portfolio. What I'm about to present may surprise some of you. I ask only that you review the evidence before forming conclusions. Gerald raised his hand. Hartley nodded toward him. My father stood, buttoned his jacket, took a moment. Robert, before we allow this to continue, I think the board deserves some context. His voice was warm and reasonable, the voice he used on difficult clients and on people he intended to outlast. Dulce is my daughter, and I love her, but she holds an administrative role here for reasons that have nothing to do with bias and everything to do with capability. She has no financial training, no legal background, no strategic experience. He paused precisely where a pause would land hardest. She also has dyslexia, which has made reading and comprehension genuinely difficult for her. We have tried as a family to support her, but there are real limitations here. What we're witnessing is a young woman who is understandably struggling after some difficult personal news. And, Mr. Whitford. Robert Hartley's voice cut clean across the room. You'll have your opportunity to respond. Right now, Miss Whitford has the floor. My father sat down. His expression communicated what he couldn't say aloud. Miranda mouthed 2 words at me from across the table. The message was unmistakable. I looked at them both. My father and my sister. The 2 people who had built an entire architecture of certainty around my smallness. And I felt something inside me that was not anger, not hurt, not even grief. It was clarity, cold and bright and precise as a surgical instrument. They weren't afraid of me embarrassing myself. They were afraid of what I actually had. Thank you, Mr. Hartley. I reached into the portfolio and lifted out the will. I won't be addressing my reading ability today. I'll be addressing this. I placed the document on the table. The room became very still. This is the last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Whitford, founder of this company, notarized September 12, 2019. The color left Gerald's face in a single visible moment. That's impossible. His voice came out wrong, too high, too thin. My mother's will was executed in 2015. I have a certified copy. You have a copy of her previous will, I said. Under New York Estates, Powers and Trusts law, a subsequent valid will automatically supersedes all prior testamentary documents. This will was executed 4 years after the one in your possession. I slid the document down the table to Robert Hartley. Mr. Ellis, would you please confirm for the record the provenance of this document? Jonathan Ellis rose from his seat in the corner. I'm Jonathan Ellis, partner at Morrison and Blake. I served as Eleanor Whitford's personal attorney from 2008 until her passing in 2021. I can confirm without reservation that this will was executed in my presence on September 12, 2019, witnessed by 2 independent notaries, with the original held in escrow at Chase Private Client. This document is legally valid, properly executed, and supersedes all prior instruments. Robert Hartley studied the will. His eyebrows made a slow, deliberate journey upward. This bequeaths 51% of Whitford Properties shares, he said carefully. He looked up. To you, Miss Whitford. Murmurs moved around the table like a wave. That document is a forgery, Miranda said, but the conviction in her voice had already begun to erode. It is not, Ellis replied, with the quiet finality of someone who has been in enough courtrooms to know exactly which battles are over. And I would advise considerable caution before making allegations of fraud without a shred of evidence to support them. Morrison and Blake's track record speaks for itself. My mother was unwell, Gerald said. His voice had returned, but it had lost its architecture. She was being manipulated by outside parties. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when elderly people are. Perhaps, I said, you'd like to explain this. I pressed play on my phone. My father's voice filled the boardroom. Eleanor is 81 years old. She does not understand the demands of modern business. I am moving to reduce her voting rights from 51% to 10%. The recording ended. The silence that followed was among the most complete I have ever experienced. That recording, Gerald started, was made by Eleanor Whitford during a board session she had every legal right to attend and every legal right to document. I kept my voice level, clinical. Factual. It demonstrates that 3 months before she executed the will you now claim reflects diminished capacity. She was alert, engaged, and sufficiently concerned about your conduct to preserve a record of it. Hartley set down the document. His expression had moved past neutral into something harder and more deliberate. Miss Whitford, would you please read the relevant bequest passage aloud? For the record. I nodded. I took a breath. To my granddaughter, Dulce Ann Whitford, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Whitford Properties LLC, along with all voting rights associated therewith. I paused. Let the words settle into the room the way something heavy settles into still water. This bequest is made with full knowledge of my son Gerald's treatment of Dulce. She has been excluded, diminished, and denied opportunity, not due to lack of ability, but due to lack of support. Miranda made a sound across the table. I kept reading. Dulce is not slow. Dulce was abandoned, and I will not allow her father's prejudice to continue to define her future after my death. I looked directly at Gerald. His hands, I noticed, were trembling. Gerald has confused credentials with character and degrees with worth. He tried to strip me of my voting rights because I stood between him and everything he wanted. He marginalized Dulce because she reminded him of the kind of person he refuses to become. The room held its breath. I built this company from nothing. I choose who carries it forward. I choose Dulce. For a long moment, my father said absolutely nothing. He stared at his mother's portrait above the fireplace, and I wondered if he could feel her watching him, the way I always felt her watching me. Robert Hartley removed his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. Jonathan, you can confirm this document is fully enforceable under New York state law. I can. The 2015 will is superseded in its entirety. Effective as of this meeting, Dulce Whitford is the majority shareholder of Whitford Properties. Margaret Coleman sat very quietly. Richard Holloway and Susan Parker exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. This changes nothing, Miranda said, though her voice had gone brittle in the way glass goes brittle when the temperature drops sharply. Even if the will holds up, which we will absolutely contest. Dulce has no business experience. She cannot run a company of this size. I'm not proposing to run the company, I said. Not today. I pulled the 2018 board minutes from the portfolio and laid them on the table. March 14th, 2018. Gerald Whitford proposed Resolution 2018-07, seeking to reduce Alina Whitford's voting shares from 51% to 10%. Stated rationale, I found the line, the founder is no longer capable of understanding modern business operations. That proposal failed by 2 votes, I continued. Alina's vote and Margaret Coleman's. I'd ask Margaret to confirm that. It's accurate, Margaret said, and the quietness in her voice was its own kind of weight. Alina called me the evening after that session. She wasn't angry about the vote failing, she'd known it would. She was angry that her own son had stood in that room and told 12 people that the woman who built the company they all relied on was no longer capable of understanding it. I'm not relitigating 2018, Gerald started. You're right, we're not. I addressed the full table. We're establishing a clear factual record that Alina Whitford was not experiencing diminished capacity when she executed the 2019 will. She was protecting herself from her own son. And she was protecting me. I paused. Those are not the actions of someone who wasn't paying attention. They are the actions of someone who understood exactly what was happening and who planned accordingly. Hartley surveyed the table. Does any board member have documentation that contradicts what has been presented this morning? The silence lasted several seconds. Gerald's jaw was moving. No words were coming. I think, said Richard Holloway, breaking the silence, we need a brief recess so legal counsel can review these documents properly. Agreed. Hartley checked his watch. 15 minutes. Jonathan, please remain available. 15 minutes became 45. The board's legal counsel, a thin, meticulous man named Patterson, spent the entire recess on calls with Morrison and Blake, Chase private client, and the New York State Court Records Office. I sat alone at the end of the table. Ellis brought me a glass of water. Margaret put a hand briefly on my shoulder. My father and Miranda had retreated to the far corner, their argument escalating in frantic whispers. Gerald's executive team hovered nearby, looking uncertain about which direction to orient themselves. Patterson returned and bent to Hartley's ear. Hartley listened. His expression moved through surprise, then calculation, then something that looked very much like resolution. Please take your seats. The room reassembled. Board legal counsel has reviewed the materials. I'll read their findings. Hartley read from his notes. The will presented this morning is valid under New York state law. It supersedes all prior testamentary documents without exception. Effective immediately, Dulce Whitford holds 51% of Whitford Properties shares with full voting rights. Someone inhaled sharply on the far side of the table. Additionally, Hartley continued, as majority shareholder, Miss Whitford holds the right to bring motions before this board, including motions pertaining to executive leadership. He looked at me. Miss Whitford, do you have any motions you wish to bring forward at this time? I stood. Gerald pushed back his chair. Robert, I strongly object to. Sit down, Gerald. Hartley's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. Miss Whitford has the floor. My father sat down. His face was the color of old newsprint. I looked around the table at 12 people who, 2 hours ago, had never once considered that I might be worth looking at. I am not proposing Gerald Whitford's immediate removal as CEO. The tension in the room changed shape. Miranda's head came up sharply. Even Margaret looked briefly surprised. What I am proposing, I said, is a vote of confidence. The board will determine whether Gerald Whitford retains their confidence in his leadership. If the majority votes no confidence, he resigns on the terms set out in the company's existing bylaws. If the majority votes confidence, I commit to not interfering with operational leadership during my tenure as majority shareholder. I let that sit for a moment. This is standard corporate governance. It is the process, Alina, established in our bylaws 40 years ago. If my father has genuinely earned this board's trust, he has nothing to be afraid of. This is theater, Miranda said. This is a vendetta dressed up as second. Margaret Coleman said simply before Miranda could finish. Hartley nodded. Then we'll proceed. All those expressing confidence in Gerald Whitford as Chief Executive Officer, please raise your hand. 4 hands, his allies, the people whose board positions had been sponsored by his recommendations over the years. All those expressing no confidence. 7 hands rose, slowly, deliberately. from people who had, for years, privately held concerns they had never had a safe reason to voice. Hartley counted. Set down his pen. The motion carries 7-4 with one abstention, Mr. Whitford. He turned toward my father. The board has voted no confidence. Per section 14.3 of our bylaws, you have 30 days to tender your formal resignation. Gerald said nothing. He stood. And for the first time in my 28 years of existing in his orbit, he looked at me, really looked at me, not with contempt, not with dismissal, with something far stranger and far harder to look at. Recognition. He left the room without a word. I know what some of you might be asking right now. Why didn't she just remove him outright? She had the power. Why give him the vote? Because revenge is not justice. Because demolishing someone does not rebuild what they destroyed. And because the woman who raised me, the woman who spent the last years of her life engineering this specific moment, didn't do any of that so I could become the thing I'd been fighting against. She did it so I could be free. That lands hit the like button. If this story is reaching you in the way I hope it is, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are not even close to done. Back to what happened next. Gerald found me in the private corridor outside the boardroom. Priscilla was already there, standing slightly behind him, mascara tracking down both cheeks in thin, dark lines. You! His voice was barely contained, a fist wrapped around glass. You ungrateful, scheming, Gerald. My mother's hand on his arm. Not here. She just destroyed this family in front of 12 people, Priscilla. I didn't destroy anything, I said. My voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. I told the truth to people who had a right to hear it. The truth. He laughed, a fractured, ugly sound. Your grandmother was in declining health. She was isolated. She was being influenced by that lawyer. Alina wrote that 5 months after you stood in front of her board and told them she was too old to run the company she built. I held his gaze. You didn't lose today because I betrayed you. You lost because she was paying attention. She always was. Priscilla stepped forward. Her voice was softer, and somehow that made it worse. Dulce, sweetheart, we were trying to protect you. We never wanted to put you under pressure you couldn't handle. Your situation. You didn't protect me. The words came out the way water comes through a dam, contained for years and then not. You erased me. You made jokes at my expense in front of 20 relatives. You paid me a fraction of what Miranda earned to do work you considered beneath her. You fired me because having me around made your narrative inconvenient. For 28 years, I waited for you to look at me like I mattered. I'm done waiting. That's not fair, she started. You're right, it wasn't. Gerald grabbed my arm. This isn't over. We will contest that will. We will bury that attorney in litigation. I pulled free. You won't win. You know you won't because you know who Alina was and you know what she was capable of when she decided something mattered. She planned for everything, including this. I walked toward the elevator. Dulce. My mother's voice behind me, very quiet. Wait. I didn't wait. The elevator doors closed on both of their faces. I leaned against the brushed steel wall and finally let myself breathe. The adrenaline that had carried me through the last 3 hours was receding, and what it left behind wasn't triumph. It was grief. Quiet, honest, long overdue grief. For 28 years of hopping things would eventually change. For every Christmas dinner and every family photo and every moment I had twisted myself into smaller and smaller configurations, believing that if I could just become quiet enough, good enough, patient enough, they would finally see me. That hope hadn't just died today. I had looked it in the eye and let it go. The elevator reached the lobby. I wiped my face and straightened my borrowed blazer. Jonathan Ellis was waiting. That was, he searched for the appropriate word, remarkable. It was necessary. Your grandmother would agree. He fell into step beside me. What happens now? I go home, I sleep. I figure out what my life looks like on the other side of today. We stopped at the revolving doors. I don't want to be CEO. I never did. I just want this company, the one my grandmother poured 60 years of her life into, to be run by people who actually care about it, not people who see it as something they're entitled to inherit. Ellis nodded once. The board will want to meet with you, soon. I know. I pushed through the door and felt the May morning hit my face, sunlight, exhaust, the full, relentless, ordinary noise of Manhattan at 11. But not today. I looked back at Whitford Tower, 42 stories of glass and steel wearing my family's name. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow is soon enough. May 19th. Gerald Whitford's resignation letter was signed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I learned about it through an email from Robert Hartley. Miss Whitford, your father has tendered his resignation effective June 15th, 2024. The board has appointed me as interim CEO, while we conduct a formal search for permanent leadership. Additionally, the board has voted to offer you a position as strategic advisor to the board, which would allow you to participate in major decisions while you determine your longer-term relationship with the company. I hope you'll consider it. R. Hartley. I read it 3 times. Force of habit. Then I forwarded it to Ellis. His reply arrived within an hour. Fair terms. No embedded complications. Congratulations, Dulce. That evening, an all-staff message went to the full Whitford Properties team. Effective June 15th, Gerald Whitford will step down as CEO. Robert Hartley will serve as interim CEO during our leadership search. The board also welcomes Dulce Whitford in her new capacity as strategic advisor and majority shareholder. We thank Gerald for his years of service and wish him well. My phone lit up immediately. Colleagues I had worked beside for 2 years, people who had walked past my desk for 24 months without once using my first name, were suddenly reaching out. Eager to reconnect. Interested in that coffee meeting. Curious about the future. I ignored most of them, but one message stopped me. It was from Patricia Morales, an executive assistant who had joined Whitford Properties in 1987 and had worked directly under Alina for 15 of those years. Dulce, Alina used to talk about you constantly. She said you saw things that other people simply walked past without noticing. I could never quite picture what she meant. I think I understand now. Welcome to the boardroom. She would be so proud of you. I saved that one. I still have it. Some validation can't come from family. And sometimes, when it finally comes from somewhere else, it's worth more precisely because of that. 1 week later, the story broke publicly. New York Business Journal, Whitford Properties shakeup, founder's granddaughter claims control after secret will surfaces. The article was careful with names. Corporate privacy maintained a polite fiction. But anyone connected to Manhattan real estate understood exactly who was being written about. Sources close to the board described the transition as long overdue and cited concerns about the previous CEO's management style that stretched back several years. Gerald and Priscilla canceled their appearance at the Metropolitan Museum Gala. Health reasons, according to the publicist. 3 major investment partners requested individual meetings, specifically with me, not with the board, not with my father, not with interim management. With me. 2 of those meetings ran over an hour. Both confirmed they would maintain their relationships with Whitford Properties. We've had reservations about Gerald's direction for longer than I'd like to admit, one told me. Your grandmother built something that deserved better stewardship than it's had. It's genuinely good to see someone who understands what she built. The social fallout spread in concentric rings through the Upper East Side. Invitations to charity events quietly stopped arriving. The Whitford name, which had opened certain doors automatically for decades, now required explanation. I didn't celebrate any of this. I didn't mourn it either. It was simply what happened when the truth stopped being managed. Margaret Coleman called that Saturday morning. How are you holding up? Honestly, I'm not sure yet. Ask me again in 6 months. Fair. A pause. You know, Alina would have handled it the exact same way. The vote of confidence instead of outright termination. Giving him a chance he hadn't earned. She always said mercy wasn't weakness. She said it was the most sophisticated form of power there was because it required you to have nothing left to prove. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. She was right. Mercy wasn't capitulation. Mercy was a choice you could only make from a position of genuine strength. And for the first time in my life, the choice had been entirely mine. June 8th, my phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. Dulce. My mother's voice sounded like it had been reduced by half. Can we talk, just us? We met at a coffee shop in Midtown. Neutral ground, somewhere Gerald wouldn't appear flanked by attorneys. Priscilla was already there when I arrived, hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched, looking like someone who had been awake for several consecutive nights. Thank you for agreeing to come, she said. I know I have no claim on that. I sat down. What do you want? To apologize. The word came out cracked like something that had been pressed under too much weight for too long. For everything, for the way we treated you, for the things we said and the things we deliberately chose not to say. Are you apologizing because you're genuinely sorry, I asked, or because the landscape has changed? She flinched, closed her eyes briefly. Both, her voice dropped. I am ashamed to admit that, but it's the truth. I convinced myself for years that I was protecting you, from expectations you couldn't meet, from pressures that would only hurt you. I told myself that story so thoroughly that I stopped questioning it. Her eyes filled. But I let your father call you worthless in front of family, in front of people who should have known better. I never pushed back, not once. And that's not protection, that's absence dressed up as care. You let it happen every single time. I know. A tear escaped. She didn't reach up to catch it. I know I did, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I can't watch what's left of this family dissolve entirely without at least trying to tell you the truth. I looked at this woman who had been my mother for 28 years, who had braided my hair when I was 6 and forgotten my birthday when I was 23, who had stood in the same room where people laughed at me and produced a small, polished smile. I can't pretend the last 20 years didn't happen, I said finally, but I'm willing to try building something honest going forward, something that doesn't require either of us to pretend. She nodded, unable to speak. It wasn't forgiveness in the way I had always imagined forgiveness would look, but it was something real, and real was a better starting point than anything we'd ever had before. August 2024. Miranda called while I was walking through Central Park on a Tuesday morning. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered on the 4th ring. Dulce, a long pause. I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but is there any possibility we could meet? There are things I need to say. We sat on a bench near Bethesda Fountain. The August heat came off the pavement in slow, invisible waves. Miranda looked unlike herself, hair pulled back without ceremony, dark circles visible beneath the kind of makeup that could only do so much, the whole careful architecture of her appearance bearing visible cracks. I've been in therapy since May, she said. No preamble, no performance. 3 times a week. That's good. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, and I have a Harvard law degree, so that's actually saying something. The small joke landed like a fragile thing she'd set down carefully. Turns out that being the golden child is its own kind of damage. Every achievement was just the floor for the next expectation. Nothing was ever finished. Nothing was ever enough. I waited. The way they treated you, she said, and her voice changed, quieter, stripped of its usual precision. I told myself for years that it was just how things were, that you were different, that my not challenging it was a form of restraint, even protection. She looked at the fountain. It wasn't. It was self-preservation. If I defended you, I became a target too, and I chose not to become a target. I know. That's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as one. I just need you to know that I see it clearly now. I see what I chose every single time. And I see you, the real you, not the version that was convenient for the story we were all telling. And I am sorry that it took me this long. We sat without speaking for a while. 2 sisters who had grown up under the same roof as strangers. I can't undo any of it, I said at last. And I'm not interested in pretending it away, but I'm also not interested in staying enemies forever. Maybe we start completely fresh. No history, no assumptions. 2 people who are trying. Miranda's eyes filled. I would really like that. It wasn't the sisterhood I'd grieved as a child, the imaginary version where we were close and loyal and fierce for each other. But it was something that might, with enough time and enough honesty, become something genuinely its own. November 2024. 6 months after the board meeting, I moved into my own apartment in Brooklyn Heights, 1 bedroom, pre-war building, a window that looked out over the bridge my grandmother had walked across to reach her first office in 1965. The rent was more than I'd ever paid in my life. I could afford it without difficulty. My new title at Whitford Properties, Director of Sustainable Development. My salary, $185,000 a year, plus dividends from my shares. The title was my own idea, a new division built around green building practices, sustainable development frameworks, environmental impact assessment. The kind of work my grandmother would have championed if she'd been given the chance to see where the world was heading. The kind of work that suited the way I had always seen things, not line by line, but as whole systems, as interconnected structures, as things that held each other up. Gerald called once a month, short conversations, polite. He asked about my apartment, about the new division, about the weather. We both maintained the careful fiction that the past was simply the past. It was easier than the alternative. Priscilla and I had lunch every other week. Slowly, awkwardly, in the particular way of people who are learning to speak honestly to each other for the first time after decades of careful avoidance, she was learning to see me as a person who existed rather than a situation to be managed. Miranda and I got coffee on Saturdays, or something close to it. We were figuring each other out, really, genuinely, from scratch. She told me about the pressure she had carried since childhood, the way achievement had become the only proof of worth she could produce. I told her about the loneliness, the years of sitting in the back of every room waiting to be noticed. Neither of us pretended it was okay, but we were both telling the truth. That was more than we'd ever had. On the wall above my desk, I'd hung my grandmother's portrait, the one that had watched over the boardroom for 40 years. Sometimes in the evening, when the light came through the Brooklyn window at a particular angle, the portrait caught it in a way that made Alina look like she was smiling at something she'd been waiting a long time to see. You did it, Grandma, I thought, more than once. You gave me the tools. I just had to be willing to pick them up. When I look back now at everything that happened, the boardroom, the will, the vote, the corridor conversation with my parents, all of it, I understand something that I couldn't have understood at 27. My grandmother didn't leave me controlling interest in a $92 million company because I was smarter than Miranda, or more deserving, or more strategically useful. She left it to me because she had spent 55 years watching what power does to people who pursue it as an end in itself. And she believed, with the specific, unshakable conviction of someone who had built something from nothing and watched it slowly be dismantled, that I was the one person in her family who would not be corrupted by it. Dyslexia is not my flaw. It never was. It is part of who I am in the same way that visual memory is part of who I am, the way patience is, the way the ability to look at a complex system and trace the invisible architecture holding it together is part of who I am. The things that made me slow in my parents' eyes, the things they pointed to as evidence that I was less, were the same things that let me see the truth when the people around me were too busy performing certainty to look clearly. Gerald measured worth by credentials, by degrees, by performance, by what you could show in a boardroom. Alina measured worth by character, by how people treated those who had no power to offer in return, by whether, when you had the ability to be cruel and you chose otherwise, that choice cost you anything. And now, for the first time, I get to measure my own worth, by my own standard, my own terms, my own truth. If you are watching this and something in it sounds familiar, if you have ever been the overlooked one, the slow one, the one they quietly wrote off while making other plans, I want to tell you something directly. You do not need a secret inheritance to prove your value. You don't need a dramatic courtroom moment or a vindicated grandmother or a 7-4 board vote to confirm what you already are. What you need is permission. Permission to stop auditing your own worth according to the standards of people who were never qualified to evaluate it in the first place. Boundaries are not walls. They're decisions about who gets access to you and on what terms. My family hurt me for most of my life, but I didn't need to match their cruelty to find my way forward. I needed to stop waiting for their approval and start trusting my own assessment of myself. That is the real inheritance. The thing Alina built that no document could ever contain, no lawyer could deliver, no boardroom could validate or revoke. She showed me what it looked like to build something from nothing, to be dismissed and to keep building, to love someone your whole family has decided isn't worth loving, to put your faith in the future rather than in the easy story the present was telling. She showed me that the people who love you most sometimes can't protect you in the moment. But they can spend years quietly making sure that when the moment comes, you won't be alone. I wasn't, I'm not, and neither are you. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever sat at the wrong end of a table and wondered when, if ever, anyone was going to see you clearly, leave a comment. Tell me your story. Tell me what you're still carrying or what you finally put down. I read them. Everyone, subscribe, hit the bell. And if you want more stories about people who found the courage to stand up from the seat they were assigned and walk toward the one they actually deserved, everything you need is in the description. Thank you for being here. Until next time.